Welcome back to the Urban Elements studio. Today we're going to be doing both sort of an introduction to the Pantograph Gridz, but also an overview of many of its uses. So I have a lot of different things that I want to talk about. Some of them are just about some of the ways that you could install it onto the table, about how you measure it to get it where you might want it. There are 3 different sizes, so if you have any questions of how you might want to go about getting answers to which one you need, and how to cut it or trim it if you need to. So we're going to go over quite a few different things on the Pantograph Gridz. I got some stuff on the table that I'm going to clear off because we'll go over these things one at a time, and I think today I'm going to be repeating myself a lot, and there's a reason. Quite often I will say something during a video, and exactly what I say is the question people ask in the comments section. I will say to do something, and they will comment and ask, should I do that? So today I'm going to repeat myself a couple of times to make sure that you understand that I am saying to do that. So I'm going to clear off some stuff and we'll get started on the Pantograph Gridz. One of the first things that I'm going to be talking about is sizing. Now, the Pantograph Gridz is a roll, and the roll on every size is 12 feet. So depending on the size of your table, you may have to trim your Pantograph Gridz down. If you do trim it, you're going to be trimming each side equally, not just one side. But the height of each one is going to be different, and there are 3 different sizes, but I only have 2 of the 3 props. The 3 different sizes are based on how big your machine is. So this is kind of a poor example because I don't have the really biggest Panto. But if you use petite size Pantos and you have a small arm machine, you're probably going to get the 12-inch Pantograph Gridz. That's 12 inches high by 12 inches long. If you use regular pantographs, regular size pantographs, you're probably going to end up with a 16-inch high by 12 feet long. That's this one. And if you have a really long, big long arm machine, a full long arm machine, they could use any size Panto. You probably end up with a 20-inch. I don't have that tube here. A 20-inch Pantograph Gridz by 12 feet. If you have any questions about which size you need, there are sizing information on the website. Basically, it will say the same thing I just said to you, but if you have any question, please contact support@urbanelements.com. We don't want you to order the wrong size because there is a restocking fee, and we don't want to have you pay that because you ordered the wrong size. So we want to make sure that you order that right size before you have to pay a restocking fee. So petite is a 12-inch Pantograph Gridz. Regular size is 16-inch, and if your machine can sew any size pantograph, then you would be getting a 20-inch. Now, the Pantograph Grid is also a little bit larger than the printed grid area, both up and above and below. And as I said, on all of them, they're 12 feet long, and if your table is not 12 feet long, you're going to load the center first and then trim off each end equally. Don't just trim off one side, because the center marking needs to be in the center of the table. So you can't just take 10 inches off one end, because then your center marking will be off by 5 inches. So make sure that you order the right size. If you have any questions, you can either call or email the office. There's always somebody in the office for support. So make sure you call if you have any question about the sizing. So there's 12-inch, 16-inch, and 20-inch. So that's the sizing. Next, I'm actually going to pull out the Pantograph Gridz so that you can see what the center marking is, starts at 0 and works its way out. And so you can understand that you're going to be trimming both ends. Make sure you pay attention to this step, because we don't want you to get excited and hurry and put it on your machine and just lop off one end because you were excited and you want to get using it. And this is not a great example of the 3 sizes pantos, because I know some of the grande pantos are actually taller than this. And this might even be too tall for a petite. But I don't use petite pantos here in the studio because I have a Q24, and I can't quite do the large 20-inch designs either, so I don't do the grande. So I don't exactly have samples for this, but I am going to pull out the Pantograph Gridz now, and I'm going to show you what it looks like and that 0 center marking. I want you to notice that the Pantograph Grid is hanging off both sides of the table just about equally. I may not have it centered on the table, but I want you to see that it is hanging off on both sides. If you see here, there's a 0 marking. This is the center of the length of your table, and it starts going out from 1-inch increments to the left and in 1-inch increments to the right. So this would go in the center of the table, and that's what you would put on first. And then once you had that center on this table, then you would measure out the 2 sides and trim off each end equally to fit your table. You don't want to just trim off one side and then this be the center of your table, and this is where your Pantograph Grid is cut at. You only want to cut it once. You've heard the saying before, measure twice and cut once. So you're going to measure the length of your table, find your center marking, put your 0 Pantograph Gridz mark there, and then you're going to measure out in each direction and then trim off each end equally so that your Pantograph Gridz fits the table with this 0 marking on the center of the length of the table. So you don't want to just get in a hurry and only cut off one end, because it's not measured in just one direction. It's measured from the center out in both directions, and you always want this to be in the center of the length of your table. And the only way to accomplish that is to cut off each end in equal proportions. So I'm going to be, I've already cut mine, so it's already going to fit, but I'll show you. I'm going to put this on the line in the center of my table. Now, my table didn't come with the line in the center, but you will see that I used whiteout to create a line on my black table so that I always have a reference point. One of the primary functions of the Pantograph Grid is to make editing marks on your pantograph for various reasons. And to do that, we would need some kind of marking implement so we could mark on the heavy-duty vinyl. The 2 obvious products for that would be either a dry erase marker or a wet erase marker. And I know a lot of people have the dry erase marker in their studio, but notice that I don't even have this one open, because I try and keep these out of my studio for a specific reason. Dry erase markers can erase with just fabric wiping across it. And the Pantograph Grid goes behind your quilt on the frame. And if you don't wipe the markings off before you remove the quilt from the frame, your quilt could accidentally brush against the top of this vinyl, and it would take with it the dry erase marker. Dry erase marker is probably then have to be washed to get it out of the quilt. And if whether this is your quilt or a customer's quilt, I don't think you want to be washing the quilt at that stage. So I don't like to have dry erase markers in the studio for that reason. I want it to be a wet erase so there can't be any accidental erasure of those markings onto my quilt. So I like to use the wet erase markers, so it can only be erased with water and a napkin when it comes time to doing that. So these are what you'll see on the back of my machine in the tray, and these I saved just as a demo, but I don't even open this up. And one of these days I might actually give this to my friend across the street. She's a teacher. We've established that I'm going to be putting the center marking on the center of the length of the table. But what I also am going to be doing is I'm going to be centering this Pantograph Gridz on the center of the height of the table also. I like to have the center of this Pantograph Gridz exactly in the center of my whole table. I don't load it, we don't load it on the very back of the machine. I know a lot of manufacturers will tell you to load the Panto on the back because it's a straight edge and it's easy to load and the Panto won't be crooked. But the problem comes up quite often. Maybe it's never for you, but it comes up quite often for various reasons that a person cannot continue to do the entire quilt with the quilt Panto positioned there. And I'll give you some examples. If a quilt is very long and on the take-up lever, that quilt buildup keeps getting larger and larger, the back of the machine or where the needle of the machine can no longer go all the way back to its starting position, so it can no longer do the back portion of the design anymore. It can't do the full Panto. So somehow the Panto has to be completely repositioned in a way that it can. Another example would be when they use maybe double batting. A lot of people are using 2 or 3 battings now to get a more dimensional look on their quilt. Well, the more batting you put into a quilt, the bigger that take-up lever is going to fill up. Again, it's going to limit where the head of the machine and the back of the machine can reach because of that buildup on the take-up lever. And if the head of the machine can't get back far enough, it's not going to be able to do the full Panto design. Other things like flannel or minky that are very bulky may also create a big take-up lever roll that are going to limit the head of the machine and limit you from reaching the very back or bottom portion of your design. So instead, we center the Pantograph Grid or your pantograph, or both, on the center of your table and start from there, because we know that you're going to be able to get that no matter what size the quilt is, no matter how many battings you use, and no matter what kind of material the quilt is made out of. You're also going to center the needle with your usable space in the front. By combining those two units together, the laser light and the needle, which work in conjunction, you'll always be able to do the full design regardless of how much rolls onto the take-up lever. So that's one reason why we do that. The next thing I'm going to talk about is different ways that you could attach this to the machine. The easiest way to do that would be with some kind of tape. You could use painter's tape on the back edge. You wouldn't want to tape it all the way around all 4 sides because you need to be able to get the Panto in it. So I would only do the edge furthest away from you on the table. You could also use duct tape, but you want to do something so that the Pantograph Gridz can't slide side by side or up and down. You want to make sure that it's completely stationary. For a long time, I used these Command brand fridge clips. These were just clips that would go along the top line of the Pantograph Gridz, and the grid clipped in place. These you only had to put on once, and I still have enough of these to run the full length of my grid. The problem is that Command no longer manufactures this particular clip, and none of the other ones function as well as this one. But they do have 2 other things that you could use. This is a poster strip that you could line up along the top edge of the Pantograph Gridz, and they also have these These are like Velcro strips. You would put one piece on the table and the other piece on the back of the pantograph grid at the very top, and that way you could remove it if you needed to, but it would maintain a stationary grip in the meantime. But these are just two options that you could use, and I'm going to show you a couple others as well. Well, so far I've talked a lot about the sizing of the pantograph grids and how to order them, also about how to measure them and how to connect them to the table. But I haven't talked much about what it is or what it's for. It is a heavy-duty vinyl that is marked from the center in both directions out. It has both a 1-inch grid and then a smaller 1/4-inch grid. The purpose of the pantograph grid is multiple uses. The easiest, most useful part, well, it's not the most useful, but it protects your pantograph. So if you're like me and you carry drinks around the studio, I have usually hot tea or iced tea in the studio all the time. If you spill a drink on your panto, it protects the panto because the vinyl is going to protect the paper. So that's number one. That's huge for me because I'm clumsy. Number two is that it allows you to edit your pantograph in a large variety of ways. So for starters, when you have starting a new quilt and you're at the very top and you want to have your full portion of the panto first and then that echo to fill in the space, the pantograph grid allows you to make markings on the grid itself so that you're not over sewing more than you need to, so you can edit where that ghost edge is and only sew what you need. It also allows you to mark on both sides with the wet erase marker where the edges of the quilt are, because you're behind the quilt, you can't necessarily see where the head of the machine is. So it marks where the edges of the quilt are, and you can also look at the design beforehand and make any editing marks on the panto itself so that you can reduce the amount of times you're going on and off the quilt, and you can do that at both the beginning and the end of the design. Another thing that you could do with it is for editing no-sew zones on the quilt. A lot of times we have different types of quilts where we want to do a panto, but we can't necessarily do a panto over every portion of the quilt. Perhaps it has a photograph in the center, some kind of medallion. It could have applique or embroidery in a portion, and we don't want to just sew directly over those. So using the needle of the machine as a guide and the laser light in the back, you can mark on the pantograph grid where that no-sew zone is, and then edit the pantograph around it so that you don't sew over that no-sew zone, and it allows you to edit in that way. Another thing you can do is actually edit the panto itself. Sometimes there's a portion of the panto that you just don't like. It could be footballs and stars, and you want to take the stars out. So you could just go through and eliminate where the star is and connect a different line through there, and you do that on the whole panto as it goes across, and that way when you're sewing you don't have to remember to do that. It's already done for you, and you don't accidentally sew it a couple times. So basically it's a huge editing tool. It also allows you, when you get to the bottom of the quilt, to edit the panto again. A panto is never, well, I'm not going to say never. It's very, very unlikely that you're going to get full panto repeats all the way to the bottom of the quilt and then it's going to end beautifully. You're almost always going to have some kind of a partial panto at the very bottom, and this is what you use to edit that. So you'd put, when you get to that point, you make a line where the very bottom of the quilt is, and then you can edit the panto to go directly up to that line but not beyond, and then you can go ahead and finish the quilt because you know exactly where that edge is. The reason that you want to do things like this is because in the front of the machine sometimes we have quilts pinned to leaders, we have snaps pinned to the quilt, We have things on the side tension that are snapped to the backing of the quilt, and depending on how much leeway you have, you don't want your machine sewing over pins or any of those things. So you want to make sure you know exactly where you need to stop, because you're not looking at the front, you're looking at the back. And you really want to be paying attention to where you're sewing. You can't be distracted by trying to also look at the front and look at the back at the same time, because you're not going to get optimal results that way. So basically, this is a huge editing tool, and it also protects the head of your machine, the timing and all of that, by not sewing over pins or clips or red leaders or zippers or anything else that are just outside of your quilt range, that are too close and you didn't mark. So these are all purposes for it. Now that I've explained all of that, I'm going to go ahead and get us back to the back end of the machine, and I'm going to go ahead and actually get this loaded on the table, and we can illustrate some of those things I just discussed. I will zoom out in a second, but this is the center of the length of my table, and you can see a very faint line here. This is going to be the top edge of where I have the top edge of my Pantograph Gridz lined up to. And I will mention that the Pantograph Gridz doesn't come with this white paper. It's just white craft paper on a roll. I just put this behind there just so it's a little bit easier to see when there is no pantograph in there, in case I want to use this for something other than a pantograph editing, like editing something on the quilt itself. So that's just regular paper that's under there. But when I'm going to put this on here, I'm going to put the 0 marking here, and then line up the very top edge on this faint white line, and then I'm going to secure the Pantograph Gridz to the table using whatever method that I decide to use today. And I think I'm going to cut myself a new piece of white craft paper, because this one's gotten a little bit wrinkled. I just wanted to zoom out and show you on a bigger scale what that looks like. This is the center of the width of the table. This is a faint line here where the top edge of the Pantograph Grid is going to go when I get it loaded. So it'll be loaded up here, and you can see my 0 marking is going to be here, and the Pantograph Grid will be approximately here with that edge lined up right on that marking. That way the center of the Pantograph Grid will be the center of the table, and we'll line up the laser light so that the head of the machine, when it's in its center position and the laser light is at the center of the grid, that way they're both centered. As you can see, I have the grid on the 0 mark, and if we pan over here, to the left hand side, you can see I have about well, let's see, 4 inches too much over here, and I'm going to pan over to the other side. This is what a new grid is going to look like when you get it on your table. And I'll move this out of the way, and you'll see it's about the same too much over here. So you have to put the grid 0 mark on the center of the table, and then cut each of these off equally. Mine is off a difference on 1 inch because of this screw, because my head won't go all the way over, so there's a 1 inch variance. But you cut off each piece equally, and this is what a new grid would look like, so that you cut off of each end in equal amounts. And also what you get with the grids is a little ruler and 1 wet erase marker, as you see right here. I'm going to go ahead and trim off my 2 edges, and I'm going to go ahead and get mine fastened down to the table, and then we can get started on some of the lessons. Well, I have the Pantograph Grid connected to the table. I have some white craft paper underneath the Pantograph grid. It just makes it easier for me to see the grid because my table underneath is black. Not everyone's going to have that issue. I did end up using these poster clips. It took me 3 packs because there's two 24-inch pieces. You could also just use tape to tape the grid in the back. But I really like this because I can open and close it, and if I needed to take the grid off in the instance of using like the groovy boards, if I wanted to do that. So I have these on there, and you can see the Pantograph grid won't shift side to side at all, so it'll make it really easy to put Panto right underneath it. This is not really the certified use for the grid, but one of the nice things is if you're drinking outside, well, it's outside for me, if you have coffee, tea, or soda and you bump your drink and it spills the grid, you could just wipe it right up and it won't get onto your pantograph. So that's kind of a nice thing. It's not really the intended use of the grid, but we are going to get into the intended use right now. That's what we're here for. You can see that I have a backing onto the frame. I have a white batting. My batting always goes all the way out to the edge of my backing. That is because when I roll up the quilt, I don't want these two ends of backing to become loose, because then I can't get proper tension on the side. And then I have a solid blue quilt top here. This is going to be my quilt, quote unquote. So this is the surface that I'm going to be measuring as my my quilt. And I'm going to turn the studio lights off here so that you can see the laser light a little bit better. So up here it'll be a little bit darker, but down here you'll be able to see the laser light. So you can see the laser light here, and the laser light moves exactly the same directionality as the head of the machine here. So wherever I move the head of the machine, the needle, that laser light is going to move also. So if I'm in the back of the machine and I can carefully look over the head, the take-up bar, I can mark where the edge of this quilt is, and I can make marks on the Pantograph grid where the edges of the quilt are. So I can go ahead and do that now, and we can make a representation of where the quilt actually is on the grid. First and foremost, the Pantograph grid is an editing tool. When you have a digital system, there's all kinds of editing tools at your fingertips that the digital system can do. And sometimes people with paper pantos get frustrated that they can't do some of the same things. Well, actually you can. The Pantograph grid allows you to edit your paper pantos in a way that allow you to do a lot of the things that a digital person can do also. One of those things is editing or clipping the edges, or clipping the top or bottom of the quilt. So this red line here at the bottom and the two sides represent the side edges of the quilt and the very bottom of the quilt. And this is the this will stay the same, the two sides, but once I do the first row and advance the quilt, then I can go ahead and erase this bottom line, because that won't be the end of the quilt anymore, and we'll just keep these two side pieces until we get to the very end, and then we would have a line up here that would represent the end of the quilt. Now I'm not going to do the whole quilt today because that's not my purpose. The purpose is just to show you how the Pantograph grid works. So this first sample is going to be the two sides and the top of the quilt. So I've chosen an early Panto. This particular one is called Plumbago. It was by Patricia Ritter. It's a 7.5 inch wide pattern. This particular one is a double row, which means that you could do two passes. You would complete the first one, and then you could either go back to the start and do the second one, or you could go the opposite way and come back. Whatever you're more comfortable doing, or whatever your machine is comfortable doing. Now, one thing I will say, you have to pay attention to how high the row is. This is a 7.5 inch pattern, but it's a double row, so you'd have to make sure that you could do that much pattern space with your size machine. So I'm going to go ahead and feed this Panto through underneath the pantograph grid, and I usually start down at the right hand side and just lift up the grid and slide it under. And as we're sliding it under, I really only have to slide it to as far as the left hand side of the quilt here, to this red line. I don't really have to bring it all the way over because we're not going to do anything beyond that. So I'm going to go ahead and slide the grid under, and you can see that the paper of the pantograph, I have 1 inch of grid above it, 1 inch of grid below it, and so that will make sure that my paper is centered once I get it in there. It's just a good eyeball. I've slid my pantograph grid, or my Panto, underneath the grid, and you can see I have about 1 inch above and below, so my pantograph is centered under the grid. And I've just gone ahead and put my left hand edge right at where the start of my quilt is going to be. In fact, I'll just scoot it down about 1/4 inch. This is the start of my design here, and this is my first complete row. This is my second complete row. This ghost pattern up here I won't be doing at all until I get to the very bottom of the quilt. This ghost echo here, at this point I'm going to be doing a little bit of it to fill in the very top, but also this is used for lining up the next row when you roll up the quilt. So I would pick an element like this, top of this here, and I would just drop the needle in there, and it comes down until you get to this point. So that's what these echoes are for. For the most part, it's for aligning the next row, but also we use them for filling in the very top and bottom of the quilt. And you can see some of this goes off of the top of the quilt, and we don't need to do that. So all you have to do when it goes off is you could just make some edit marks and edit these pieces back together so that you can just sew this in one pass. And visually it's not going to be noticeable because you're really just sewing on the edge of the quilt. So you could edit all the way across the bottom just on this ghost piece, and you are going to sew this ghost piece, and then when we get to the end you are going to do some editing at that side. I'm going to do the ghost echo at the bottom first, where I've edited it, and you can watch both the laser light where I follow the editing of the ghost echo, and you can also watch the head of the machine as I sew along the very edge of the top of the quilt. And you'll notice this time I'm using a blue thread on a solid blue quilt. It's going to show up, but it won't be as bad as a contrasting color. But again, if this were even lower contrast thread, it would be even better. Certainly if it was a patterned fabric like a floral or a geometric, the quilting would be even less noticeable. So those of you who are just beginning, don't panic over that, and don't judge yourself against professionals. Only judge yourself against your I'm going to go ahead and do the first full row on camera, and then I will do the repeat off camera, and then I'm going to show you the front, and that will then we can look at what the front looks like on the actual quilt. But I might speed this up so you won't have to watch the full thing. I've done my echo at the top and my 2 full rows. So at this point I can erase the red line here where the echo is, but I can keep my 2 sides. And I'm just using water on a paper towel here to get rid of the wet erase mark. And now as I advance the quilt, what I'm going to be doing is using the echo again just to advance the quilt. I put the needle in at the top of this design and roll the quilt with the needle in the quilt until the laser light went from here to here, and then I could pull the needle up and relock the machine, the take-up bar and the backing bar, and go ahead and get ready to sew the 2 rows again. When you got all the way to the top of the quilt, we would be making a line up here where the top of the quilt fell, and it could fall anywhere in here. It could fall here. We only could have maybe 4 or 5 inches. But wherever that line fell, then we would make another editing mark wherever it was of how much of the design we could sew, and then we would go ahead and sew that last piece, and that would finish the quilt off. Just as a for instance, if we had gotten all the way to the bottom of the quilt and this line represented the bottom of the quilt, we would only have this 1 row left to do, but we still would have to edit some of these pieces. And you can edit them in any way that you want to. I just look at the design and I make decisions. But I would do the main part of here, but where there was a little pieces of this, I might go back and just do those little pieces because they only have to come in and out 3 times. So that's how you would use the editing for the top and bottom and for the 2 sides. But I'm going to show you another thing you can do as far as editing for another type of editing next. You can see by making the editing marks, we really didn't go over the edge here at all. We only have a little tiny bit here, and at the opposite end we didn't go over at all either. See if I can get down there. And why it's so important not to go over the quilt so far is really to protect the machine, the head of the machine. Because I have all of these things here that I have the backing connected to the frame. I've got pins all across here. Some people use zippers, some people use snaps. I also have pins and clips on the side, both sides. And I never want the head of my machine to run over pins, clips, zippers of any kind. So I need to know exactly where those are. I need to know exactly where the edge of the quilt is when I'm behind the machine. You're totally focused back here. You can't be focused on the front of the machine, worried about your head running over pins, needles, zippers, or whatever. If the head of the machine runs over any of those things, while it's running, you very well could knock the timing out of the machine, which means that the entire head of the machine could have to go to service, and that could be several $100s, and you could be out of a machine for weeks, depending on how far away your service technician is. Mine is in another state, and it usually takes about 4 to 6 weeks. So you really want to protect your machine by not running over the any obstacles, pins, zippers, clips, and that's why it's important to know where the edges of the quilt are. Also, you don't want to be wasting thread. And another thing that can happen if you don't base the edges down is that sometimes the hopping foot can get underneath the quilt and sew through the quilt, but the hopping foot is underneath it. And in order to get that out, because it will tie itself in a knot there, you really have to use a seam ripper and scissors. And sometimes you can get it out without making a hole in the quilt, but sometimes you make a hole in the quilt. If it's your quilt, maybe it's not terrible, maybe you could trim the quilt down a little bit, but sometimes it's a customer quilt and it doesn't go over quite as well. So I always like to thread base the very edge of my quilt down so I can't accidentally get the hopping foot back underneath the quilt edge. But I really like to edit the design so that I don't have to go on and off the quilt. But I'm going to show you next another important one. Sometimes we have a no-sew zone. On the digital quilting, it's easy to do those. If you have an applique, if you have a photograph, if you have an embroidery, a lot of times people don't want you to sew over those. They want you to do a pantograph over the whole quilt, but leave the photograph not quilted, or the embroidery not quilted, or the applique piece not quilted. So it's easy with the digital, but you could also do the same thing with the Pantograph Gridz. So if you have a mark or a picture or whatever on the front, you would do the same thing that you do with the head of the machine and the laser light. You would move the head of the machine around the obstacle that you're trying to trace and make markings on the grid with the laser light so that you know how to draw the outline of that item in the back as well. I have three imaginary shapes here on my quilt. There's a circle, a rectangle, and a swag, and we can imagine these to be anything we want. The center one could be a photo, the swag could be an applique, and maybe the circle could be some kind of elaborate doily or embroidery, and we don't want to stitch over them, or our client doesn't want to stitch over them. So what we could do is use the grid to create a no-sew zone on our pattern, Panto, and we could go ahead and show you how to do that in the back. While the machine, if we're going to get ready to trace, we take our needle and we try and get it as low to the quilt as we can. So we have the quilt needle hovering right above the design, and then in the back we look where the laser light is corresponding on the grid. And by making markings all the way around that circle, watching where the needle is meeting the edge of the circle all the way around, we can create a beautiful circle on our grid that would create the outline of the embroidery. And the same with our photograph here, and the same with our swag. So we would just use the head of the machine, moving along the item that we wanted to outline, our no-sew zone, and we would just go ahead and trace it on the grid in all three instances. Once we have our no-sew zone, first I always go ahead and put an X in it so I know when I get to it I'm not going to sew that. And then when I'm coming to it, now I would probably not have all three of these in one row, but I know that my quilt goes over to here. When I come to this particular design, I know I'm sewing left to right. I might just go ahead and eliminate this piece, and I'm not going to sew any of that. So I might just come down here and do this. Just make one little extra bump here and then end it here. This is going to be from the previous row, and on that previous row I might just go ahead and end it here. So another thing you can do, and the same over here, this particular piece I might do just do this, and we would eliminate that piece. And if you're worried about how close you get to it, one of the things you can always do is start at the shape itself. In this instance, you could start right here with your needle and take off that direction. And on this particular piece, you would start right here and take off this direction. So here you'd be sewing left to right, and here right to left. And that way you'd get really precise mark right there at the very edge of the piece. And This is an odd shape, so all we'd have to do is shorten these curves, shorten that, and we're just going to go here, we're eliminating these pieces altogether, shorten this down a little bit. So, and when we get here, we're just going to eliminate these pieces, and we could take back up here. So all of this is gone, and so we're starting here and get to there, and then we could start back and go the rest of the way. So it's really easy to do no-sew zones using the grid. You can edit them in any way you want. If you don't like the way you edited it, you could always just wipe it off with a paper towel with a little water on it and try to edit again. And you could do it over and over again as many times as you want. Each time you advance the quilt, if you have a new no-sew zone, you just wipe it over and start again. But the most precise way is to start right at your no-sew zone and sew off in that opposite, the direction that it needs to go off to. So left to right or right to left if you're comfortable doing that. I pulled this club set out because it has several examples of other reasons why the Pantograph Grid is very useful. One of them is, well, first of all, this club set, just to tell you, there are multiple designs that are based around an individual theme. This particular one is called Daisy Doodle, and you'll notice that all of the designs are the same, but they're in different formats. Like this particular one is in a circle. This is in a different size circle, and you have setting triangles, corner triangles. This particular one has corner units. This is a corner, and this is a full-size panto with the two, the top and bottom, or the repeat, so you can get the lined up for your next row. So that's what the design set is, but the grid is very useful in placing these pieces when you need to get a design centered exactly in a block unit, or a circle located exactly in a circle or in a corner. If you're doing unique designs like this, a more custom work with your pantos, these can really help you center your designs really well, using the grid by marking where the block is using the grid and then centering the panto exactly underneath the grid. So that's one example on this particular panto. The other example is these circles. Somebody might not want to do all of these circles on here because circles can be a little bit daunting, especially if you're kind of new. One in the middle of the flower you might be willing to do because it's the center of the flower, but all of these extra ones you might want to edit, or edit at least some of them so that you don't have so many. So one of the things you could do is just like cross these out on the grid so that you know not to sew them, and that way you don't have quite as many, because if you don't sew circles kind of perfect, they kind of show up because the eye kind of knows what a circle looks like. So that's another thing you can do, is edit out a component of a panto if it's something that you don't like. It could be a star on the top of a Christmas tree. It could be any number of things on the panto design that you just want to edit out, or that you wanted to add along the way so that you could remember to sew it. Because when you are doing a panto, sometimes you get into a meditative state and you're just following along. And by making those little edit marks on the Pantograph Grid, it helps you remember to do them even if you're kind of in that zone. Another thing that's really useful in this as an illustration is that this is almost like a repeat on itself, and sometimes people could get confused by this, and sometimes what you could do is make little arrows telling you which direction to sew in which piece. So you could do an arrow this way and then an arrow that way. And sometimes people find that really useful, so they don't get confused, or if they have a thread break or something, they know where to pick back up at. So you could just make little arrows on the pantograph grid to tell you which direction you're sewing when you have pieces that sew over top of themselves or close to each other like that. So those are just some of the other ways that you could use the pantograph grid to help make your pantograph sewing a lot easier. I know we covered a lot today, but that's because the Pantogrid does a lot. And so there was a lot of information to try and get across to you. Just to go over a couple things again to make sure, because they really are important. The Pantograph Grid comes in 3 different sizes. There's a 12-inch, a 16-inch, and a 20-inch. And if you're at all confused about what size you need, either email support@urbanalements.com or call the office. There's also information on the website about how to figure out which size you need. But it's really important that you get the right size when you order it, because there is a restocking fee, and we don't want to have to charge you that, so we would rather you get the right size when you order it the first time. So make sure you get the right size, and we don't mind answering questions before you order it. The other really important thing is to remember that you have to center the pantograph grids on your table, both up and down and side to side, before you trim it. And this 3-page instruction booklet that comes inside will explain to you how to do that. And when you trim it, you should get equal pieces off of each side of the pantograph grids left over. These are the 2 pieces left over from mine, and you'll notice they are equal in size. So you're not just going to take a big piece off of one side, because that would tell me that the center 0 mark is not centered at the center of your table. So make sure that you are cutting equal parts off of the left and the right so that your grid is centered. I also just used craft paper underneath mine, just because my table's black. Not everyone's going to have a black table. I just made it easier for my grid, for me to see my grid. And you could just tape yours down with any kind of tape. I just happen to have found the photo or poster clips at Walmart, and that's what I used to put mine down, because it held them really nice, and they don't slide side to side. So that's what I used. The Pantograph Gridz is great for editing. It helps you edit both the side to side, the edges of your quilt, and both the top and bottom. It's also great for editing no-sew zones, for if you have embroidery, photographs, applique, or anything like that, and then you can edit around those no-sew zones. It also helps you place quilting designs that are unique, like circles, corner square triangles, half square triangles, corner elements, and a border. And so by marking those elements using the pantograph grid, you can get the design perfectly located under the grid where the marking is, so you have that perfectly centered on your border or your corner where you need it. The grid also allows you to edit some of these elements in or out that you may not want on your grid, on your panto, because it's just maybe too much for you, or you wanted to add something. I gave the example of maybe eliminating some of these circles just by putting an X through it. When you are doing a panto, sometimes you get into a meditative state and you're not really paying attention, you're just kind of zoning out. And by putting that X over it and just a line straight through that you want to go to, it just helps keep your thought right where you want it to go, and you edit all those things out without sewing over them accidentally. And also you could do little arrow marks if they're confused about which direction to sew, or you think you might get confused. It helps keep you clear about your directionality as you're sewing. So any kind of editing you want to do on a paper panto, the Pantograph Gridz is perfect for that. So I want to thank you. I know it's kind of a long video, but there's so much to go over on the grids. The best time to get Pantograph Gridz is when they go on sale, of course, and Urban Elementz does a sale twice a year. They are really just a once in a lifetime purchase. You're never going to need another one unless for some reason you upgrade to a much larger machine. So it's a one-time purchase. They should last a lifetime, barring some kind of natural disaster. You can put them on your wish list and keep it for a holiday item if you want also. But they're really great and they really protect your Panto investment also. I've never had a Panto get damaged or destroyed as all the years that I've been using the Pantograph Gridz, so they're really useful. I'm going to be doing a lot more videos in the coming months on the Pantos, paper Pantos, so keep an eye out for those. Until then, I want to thank you for spending some time with us here in the Urban Elementz studio. Until next time, thank you, take care of yourself and take care of each other, and we'll see you next time.